The pandemic has quickened the pace of digitalization. To effectively tap into the opportunities, it's important to consider the needs and capacities of the most vulnerable in society. Also, digitalization is about much more than economic and social issues. It's also a fundamental human right issue concerning the right to privacy, expression, and movement. Young people, women, and other vulnerable and disadvantaged groups are a target group of the regional program Reconomy. So, in this episode, we'll talk about how can benefits of digitalization of education be more inclusive and to the more often left behind. What can the Western Balkan countries learn from Estonia? Is blended learning the future? How is vocational education and training affected? I'm pleased to welcome Ivana Georgievska, Trin Lasi, and Agnieszka Kroskovska. Ivana is the vocational education and training expert at the Education for Employment project in North Macedonia. She has more than 10 years of experience working on the vocational education and training system. Trin is a director of Tallinn School of Economics, one of the oldest vocational schools in Estonia. Previously, she has worked in the field of education, leading various education institutions. Agnieszka is a gender and social equity coordinator at Helvetas, supporting the organization to walk the talk at institutional and country program levels. Ivana, I would like to start with you. With the closure of education and training institutions, learning is taking place remotely through various digital platforms. Do you think the conditions for this have been available before the coronavirus outbreak? Do you think some eyes had to be opened by a pandemic?
Good question, Sabin. Thank you for posing it. Actually, before the outbreak of the pandemic, there were certain initiatives of utilizing and deploying various platforms on part of higher education institutions, training providers, etc., for certain offer. But it's a whole different story when one talks about a shift to remote learning to a whole education system. And in that respect, I can see that before the pandemic, UNICEF, together with the British Embassy, they were investing in developing the Arduino platform, which was initially intended to serve youngsters from 3 to 10 years old. And they were supporting the national institutions for that. And actually, it was a great basis when the outbreak of the pandemic happened for shifting primary education to utilize this platform, which afterwards was also expanded to be used by secondary education as well. Our project, Education for Employment in North Macedonia, was also experimenting through one initiative with the learning management system Canvas. We were supporting the classes in Evian and the vet school Mihailo Pupin for blended learning, actually enhanced teaching and learning practices using this platform.
What about the digital divide?
So, as you said, the pandemic catalyzed quite a lot of situations that were eye-openers. Actually, we all became aware of the digital divide that was happening due to lack of access to internet in the first place. Then also the lack of devices in households, especially in those who had multiple members, more students within one household, working parents that needed to work remotely. So this was also became obvious as an impediment for remote learning. For the sake of the discussion of digitalization, I will not dwell on the options of remote learning, like utilizing TV for that, etc. I will stick to the digitalized forms. So another eye-opener was related to the learning materials. Were there already digitized learning materials? What materials actually could be digitized for various types of learning? And basically for vocational education and training, it became obvious that something that was already realized as a difficulty from the aspect of learning materials, it was exacerbated with the pandemic. And this is basically one of the areas that we intend to support in the future.
What about the digital skills?
Another point is the digital skills, both for the students and for the teachers, in how fast they could shift to the remote learning, how fast they could adapt. And besides the digital skills for utilizing various technologies, the tools, applications, etc., it's also the question of pedagogy of blended learning, distant learning, because there's a difference between teaching physical presence and teaching online. And this also became very obvious that investment is needed in pedagogy for distant learning to help out the teachers.
Could you name one country that already had the conditions for digital learning before the pandemic?
So here I will mention Estonia as one country that actually paid dividends from their investments in the past. We all know that it's a society that since decades has been investing in digital infrastructure, and what is more, in competencies of its citizens to utilize this digital infrastructure. Their teachers have been trained in digital teaching and learning, internet safety. 87% of their schools before the pandemic already had e-learning experiences. So the shift to remote learning in Estonia did not come as a shock. So from this, there's a lesson actually to be learned, that investments in various mechanisms that should support a system to be more resilient need to be made.
Trin, could you tell us what makes Estonia special in digital learning? Was this thanks to early adoption of technology long before the coronavirus began to wreak havoc on the world?
It's a fact. It's a fact that we were early and we were one of the beginners here in this region. But I think more important and more, it should be more emphasized the process, how Estonia has planned and implemented digital education in general. And to start with, I can say that we are celebrating in a way the 20th anniversary of digital education in Estonia, because in the year 2000, there was a very strong broad-based agreement in Estonian society between the most relevant stakeholders. Among them, there were all public universities, the Association of ICT companies, but also Estonian government. And together they formed a foundation called Estonian Infotechnology Foundation. And the main idea was to make all the preparations, all the strategic discussions, analyses, and plans necessary to start implementing those innovative plans. And what they did, they planned curricular development on both higher education level, on vocational education level, and general education level. They started equipping schools with the technology. They started providing trainings for teachers, preparing methodology for digital learning materials. So there was a really intensive period of planning that took place in the year 2000 to 2005. And when Estonia joined EU in 2004, then we had also the access to European funds. And I think thanks to this preparedness that we had on society, the funds, the social fund, other European, let's say, finances, they were really used with this good purpose to start implementing all those agreements they had made.
So it started early, already 20 years ago, and it's a long process, right?
It's a long process, and you have to be very patient because you really cannot have rapid results. We do have some bright success stories that gave us as a country and as a society a hint that we are on the right way. For example, did you know that Skype was invented by Estonians? And it happened in the beginning of 2000. So then at the same period, we started with e-school program for Estonian education that has been since today actively used, and that acted as a heart of distance learning that was caused by coronavirus. So we made so many preparations already 20 years ago. And now when the coronavirus happened, I can say that those schools who had been implementing all the digital education and learning possibilities, they were not shocked. They just in a way switched on a different mode. But yes, I think that not that much of the fact of early adoption, but the process that was built up already 20 years ago, that has led us to where we are right now. And in Estonia, I can say that Wi-Fi is really a human right, and we do everything we need to communicate with the government, the state, via different digital systems. So yeah, I think the process played a crucial role.
Ivana, a key factor in vocational education and training is its focus on practical skills and work readiness. This makes remote learning difficult. How do you respond to this, considering that your project applies an inclusive systems approach where facilitation of sustainable and scalable results is critical?
Very true and very relevant what you are saying, Sabine. The necessity for acquisition of skills and their practicing is crucial for vocational education so that a student becomes competent for the qualification they study for. And quite some processes were disrupted by the pandemic. For this, actually the working world was disrupted. However, we tried to intervene in certain solutions that could help these processes during the pandemic. We supported the Economic Chamber of Macedonia to produce COVID protocols, which actually were to help the delivery of practical training in the companies during times of pandemics. Of course, always respecting the decisions of the government regarding the physical presence of the students either in schools or at the premises of the working place. However, as you just said, Sabine, our project actually focuses on sustainable and scalable results and solutions. We did have discussion with our partners when the outbreak of the pandemic happened. And we decided that we're going to embark to support various interventions that are going to have lasting value for the system. And we are currently investing actually in establishing a digital portal for matchmaking schools and companies. As you know, one of the major foci of our project is the strengthening of the cooperation between the private sector and the educational institutions. So this portal is intended to match businesses and schools, that is to say students, for the needs of work-based learning. And this portal is going to be the ownership of the Economic Chamber of Macedonia, but in cooperation with the national education institutions. Another important area where we are currently investing is a platform for professional development of teachers. The world of work is changing, the pedagogical approaches are changing, and teachers do need support in a timely fashion, in an accessible way to continuously upgrade their knowledge and competencies. So we are currently in this way helping the Vocational Education and Training Center to basically modernize and optimize their own mandate in supporting vet school staff, primarily vet teachers, for the professional development. So besides the establishment of such platform, we're also helping them in refurbishing a room and equipping the same so that they can create various webinars, record information to be placed afterwards on this platform.
Is blended learning the future?
Related to what I already mentioned, the pedagogy for distant learning, realizing that this is an important integrate part of the overall story of remote learning. And because in future, I believe that the way to go will be basically the blended learning, the enhancement of the teaching and learning process through combining physical presence and utilizing technology for better effects in education. So for this purpose, together with the Swiss Federal Institute for Vocational Education and Training, we developed a training for distant learning pedagogy that a group of teachers just completed, and we intend to support dissemination of this knowledge further to other groups of teachers. Another intervention where our project also helped was the transformation of non-formal offer into digital form. That is to say, the theoretical part of the training was digitized, while the practical training remained to be done at the premises of the employer. Also, mentioning the learning materials, we intend to support the institutions in developing mechanisms for sustainable production of video materials that will be used by the vocational education system. So these are all interventions that represent the basis efforts that we hope will yield results in the future for improved education.
Have you realized the potential of advanced technologies such as virtual reality for learning?
Of course, the processes of digitalization in vocational education go even further. In developed countries like Switzerland, we also see advanced technologies being used, like using virtual reality for learning, for example, how to paint the car. And we realize the potential of these advanced technologies, but of course it requires both resources and time for this story to develop further. And with all things considered, the BET system is very complex. And for much as a project is supporting the system, it cannot do the addressing of the gaps on its own. It requires a serious commitment of all stakeholders so that we create a more quality system which would be resilient to other potential crises.
Trin, back to you. How can other countries in the Western Balkans learn from Estonia in digital learning?
From east side, we have a big neighbor, Russia. In south, we have other Baltic states, but in north and west, we have Scandinavian countries. So I can say that when we became independent in the beginning of 90s, we very much looked at our neighbors, Scandinavian countries, and especially Finland, that is only 80 kilometers away. So our neighbors helped us a lot. And since Estonians have this mentality of being better than your neighbor, then we had a really ambitious goal to become one day better than our friends in Finland. But really, I must say that we learned from Finland a lot. And what makes it easier is the similar cultural background and similar values. I think this is also one thing you have to bear in mind, that education system is so much integrated with a general cultural background. So to learn from Estonia, you have to understand some basics. But I think there are many things you can learn from. And one thing is that you have to plan the processes with a really long sense of perspective. You have to be patient because you don't have really rapid results. And you have to keep those broad-based agreements like politics proof, because you cannot change those programs with every new government. This is something that must be solid and mutually agreed that we can change some other things. But if we have a really like long-term goal, then we have to all contribute, and you don't mess with politics in this sense. And that has helped us and kept us on track, I think, a lot. And one thing that in Estonia, we realized, thanks to our really like developed neighbor Finland, is that if you ask your neighbors for best practices, don't focus on the best practices, rather ask what are the mistakes they made and what are the mistakes that you could avoid. So really go thoroughly through all the aspects you would like to learn from. And one more advice I would like to say is that using digital technology in education cannot be a goal in itself, because what we realized in Estonia is that our teachers are doing actually old things in a new way. We used to have those plastic slides to show for teachers with graph projectors. Then we started to use PowerPoint slides, but they're still slides. They're passive, and you only show it on the screen, but the ideology and the idea is the same. You haven't changed nothing. You haven't benefited from the use of technology. So what we started to do, I think approximately 5-10 years ago, we started to think, what is the added value that you can have from the technology? Not doing old things in a new way, but how can we be so innovative that we are doing new things in a new way? So we also agreed that teachers shouldn't ask students to put their mobile phones away in the classroom. The question is, if they're using their mobile phones anyway, so how they could be used in learning process, for example, so that to make it more more versatile. So these, let's say, questions and those encouragement to do things differently, to be innovative, to test, to try, to learn from your mistakes. This curiosity is something that we have promoted a lot among teachers, and that could be done in Balkan also.
How to benefit from the use of technology in education?
You cannot use technology or digital education in a way to promote competitiveness in a way that some schools do, some schools don't. Thanks to using European money, Estonia was in the situation that everything that is created with the support of the European Union, it's a public good. Everyone can access it. So it means that you can start communities using the same practices. If you have some more innovative communities, then the products, digital learning materials, for example, they are accessible for everyone. So it helped the whole country, not only some schools, because if you really want to be accessible in terms of education, you have to make sure that education is equally accessible, it is equally with high quality, and the state must in a way keep an eye on it, that it is equally developed, not only some places where you happen to have more enthusiastic developers. So you have to keep an eye from the, let's say, point of view of the school owner. Is it the ministry, municipality? And as I said, long perspectives, patience, and politics proof. These are the keywords I would like to emphasize. And also, if possible, and if the traveling is again possible, I think it's really important to gather together a group of enthusiasts to go and see in other environments what are the aspects that work, that are relevant for you, because when promoting or describing our systems, we might not concentrate on some aspects that are relevant for you. So going, seeing, experiencing, analyzing yourself, and then thinking what could be transferred to your society and system. This is something that works very well.
Artificial intelligence, big data, cloud computing, and so on. These are innovations that we hear often about digitalization. The pandemic has quickened the pace, but to effectively tap into the opportunities. Agnieszka, How can digitalization be more inclusive to women and other vulnerable and disadvantaged groups?
Well, in terms of big data and AI, I'm not an expert, so I won't pretend to be one. However, I would think the potential capabilities of such type of digitalization could benefit women and marginalized groups in the sense of being able to better understand trends that can affect them, and see how systems can be improved to better address the needs of these groups, especially in times of crisis. Otherwise, also being able to understand everyday movements and trends of these groups, for mapping purposes, for being able to understand the limitations and opportunities of improving access to services for these groups, access to information based on limitations they face being part of those groups. So for example, if you're thinking of women's mobility, you know, what are safer areas? What are areas that make their lives more convenient in terms of their everyday responsibilities and things like this, so that you're mitigating distances and associated costs and associated risk factors for example, women from migrant groups, from disadvantaged groups, to be able to have an easier life, basically a better life.
How can digitalization help identify information gaps or blind spots in the systems that exist?
For example, you know, if you're talking about e-governance systems, you know, are there enough questions being asked to be able to, for example, identify the fact that maybe there is a trend that a certain group simply is not being responded to in an efficient and effective manner? And is that simply an innocent oversight, or is that a bias that exists against that group, and it's embedded as part of the digital system to basically ignore asking certain types of information, which by default then excludes that group from being serviced and catered to?
Do you think digitalization can help to identify the very same problems digitalization can also cause?
I think that's a bit the sort of double-edged sword, you know, or the caught between a rock and a hard place. I think for everything good that digitalization and AI and big data can offer, there's also all the negative things that can be produced and in turn be used and manipulated. So I think that's on a sort of bigger, broader scale. Then, of course, digitalization can help bridge gaps in terms of access to services, access to information, access to training and education, especially for more remote groups or more mobile groups. But again, this can't just be a matter of handing over a mobile phone or a computer without the necessary support systems in place to help women or other marginalized groups have the capacities to use these technologies in an informed way, in a responsible way, and in a way that serves them ultimately.
So there seems to be no silver bullet in this case.
I think there's no silver bullet solution. I think it really needs to be a comprehensive, holistic approach, bearing in mind risk factors that also are always there. But I think digitalization has a huge potential, for example, to address things like gender-based violence. You know, women in precarious situations, or anyone in a precarious situation facing violence, because indeed they have to walk longer distances at odd hours in less secure neighborhoods, But if there are online services and they know how to use their phone, that can immediately alert either certain communities that come into play to intervene or certain local authorities that can come into play. You know, these are all excellent opportunities for increasing security and access to information and services. But these need to be made accessible, not only in terms of quantities, but also in terms of capacity and affordability and language. And these types of criteria that need to be considered.
Do you think digitalization is about much more than economic and social issues? That it's also a fundamental human right issue, considering the right to privacy, expression, and movement?
Even the social and economic issues are actually rights-based issues because they're very closely linked to everyone's fundamental right to having a secure livelihood, to having decent and safe employment, to having certain social safety nets in place. So I think even the economic and social aspects are very much rights-based aspects. And then indeed, absolutely, I think there are issues related to, as mentioned before, e-governance, you know, and to what extent do you use information to better service your citizens and your populations and your residents? And to what extent can that information then be manipulated and used to control, to survey, to limit your population? I think this is an extremely difficult and risk, you know, full of risks situation.
How has the pandemic affected?
Indeed, unfortunately, digitalization has been used against populations under the guise of emergency situations that call for extraordinary measures. So I think it's extremely important to pay attention to the basic human rights of people, both, again, the positive aspects where absolutely it's about right to information, right to access to services like education, which, for example, during this pandemic has been hugely impacted. And to a certain extent, where possible, online platforms have facilitated continuing education services. But for a massive amount of youngsters, of youth, of adults continuing their education, it's been a huge disruption, and that will have impacts that I think we won't understand for a very long time. So I think it's absolutely fundamentally an issue of human rights on so many different levels, because without education, your economic potential is lower. Without access to basic health services, for example, getting information online, you know, do I have COVID? Are these symptoms of COVID? In absence of a local clinic or a local doctor or nurse who can inform you, it's all interdependent. And I think it comes down to basic fundamental human rights. Again, depending if it's positively or negatively used and promoted.
All right. Thank you for watching another round of Inclusive Plug powered by Reconomy. So what do you think? How do you think can benefits of digitalization of education and more generally be more inclusive to the more often left behind? Please send us your thoughts in the comment section below. We have interesting topics coming up, so stay tuned and hit the subscribe button. This was Sabine, a communication manager at Reconomy, a program of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency implemented by Helvetas in 12 countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Thank you for tuning in and see you soon.